The news day continues here on One News Now. I'm Riza Diaz. U.S. President Joe Biden is convinced that Russian President Vladimir Putin has decided to invade Ukraine, warning that such an attack could happen in the coming days. Biden said Russian troops currently have Ukraine surrounded and that Washington believes Moscow could target Ukraine's capital, Kyiv. Now, U.S. leader insisted it is not too late to de-escalate the return and the negotiating table. Now, but warned that if an attack comes, Putin will have slammed the door shut on diplomacy. Now, what are the implications of the growing tension in Ukraine for the Philippines? Let's get insights from security and defense analyst. Mr. Jose Custodio is joining us this afternoon via Zoom. Mr. Custodio, good afternoon.
Hello, good afternoon.
Professor, good afternoon, Professor. Could you give us in a nutshell, a short background on the ongoing tension between the United States and Russia over Ukraine?
Well, basically, there's really bad blood between the Ukrainians and the Russians ever since going back through history more than 100 years ago, even during the time of the Russian Revolution. Okay, so, and then during the Second World War, the Ukrainians were actually so fed up with the Russians that when the Germans invaded them in 1941, the Ukrainians actually thought that the Germans were liberators, only to be disappointed later on. And then we fast forward to the Cold War, that Ukraine is part and parcel of the USSR. And then when the USSR collapses in the latter part of the 20th century, Ukraine finally gets its independence. The independence has been delayed for more than 100 years. Okay, so in the post-Cold War environment, Russia was felt so insecure that it wanted to reassert itself in areas that it had previously dominated, and one such area happened to be Ukraine. It was successful in Belarus, okay, which is that the north of Ukraine is a country that used to be called Belarusia, but is now known as Belarus, and that it has a pro-Russian administration there, a pro-Russian leadership there. So that's why there are Russian troops stationed there. In effect, because following the collapse of the Cold War, many former Soviet, or a number of former Soviet states, and many Warsaw Pact countries, former Warsaw Pact countries, drifted to the West, and Russia saw that as a threat to its security and its dominance. So that's why that, in a nutshell, is what we are witnessing now. Russia's attempts to reassert its dominance over states that are trying to protect their sovereignty. And Ukraine is just one such state.
Professor, our country being an ally to the United States, how does this actually affect us from the business and diplomatic standpoint?
Well, basically, right now, the country, the world right now is reeling from the pandemic. Okay, so we really don't want to have one more catastrophic event that will upset the global markets and the economy, and a major war breaking out in Eastern Europe that has the potential of bringing in NATO and the United States. Will definitely affect the stability of the world, and in effect, and by extension, even the global economy. In fact, right now we already have there's inflation going on, and so on and so forth, precisely because of the what they call the supply chain problems. Okay, so imagine the disruption that a war would create. Okay, in terms of international traffic, of stabilities in Europe, its market there, okay, which will then radiate around the world. So that's something that will affect us, okay. But I'm just saying, in that aspect, there's all the others. For example, in a way, not just in Ukraine, because we tend to think of only Ukraine and several hundred Filipino OFWs there. But that's not just our OFWs in the area. We also have OFWs in Central Europe, and any conflict there will create instability in Central Europe. Like, for example, Germany. In Germany, we have many, not just OFWs, but Filipino citizens who have already migrated there. You know, we keep on talking about OFWs only, but there are actually Filipino migrants already who have gained residents in many of these countries, and they will also be directly affected by any conflict that arises in Ukraine, because it will all these surrounding states will go on heightened alert, okay, and fearful of any spillover of conflict, okay. And if that happens, well, the foreign affairs, we will have the Department of Foreign Affairs has to have in place already, which I presume they have already. I mean, they have plans for the extrication of Filipino nationals there. However, it's also affected by the willingness of Filipinos to, go and leave, or to flee the area, because sometimes, many Filipinos now, if they are off W, sometimes they will be thinking of what's my future if I go back to the Philippines. So that also creates a problem for us, because of the situation of the economy here. So many of our Filipino OFWs will try to risk it over there. Can't blame them. Such is life. In this world, that in this difficult times that we're living in now. Okay, so because, like I said, it's a difficult time already because of the pandemic. Well, hopefully the negotiators are successful in heading off a conflict that will make things even worse.
Professor, with that being said, President Joe Biden sees and believes that an attack could happen very soon. Do you agree? Do you think this will really escalate into an actual war among powerhouse nations?
Well, we can start with what type of conflict does Putin want? Okay. Ukraine is going to be its toughest opponent since the Cold War. Since the Cold War ended, um, r- all the military adventures of the Soviet Union following, even during the Cold War, okay, were against countries that were either diplomatically isolated or had weak militaries. Like, for example, Afghanistan, its military was practically powerless against the Soviet invasion in 1970s. And then we have Hungary and Czechoslovakia in the 50s and the 60s. These were countries well within the Soviet sphere of influence and thus dominated, easily squashed. Okay, and then we have Syria now, which the Soviet Union, which the Russians are engaged in. Okay, again, what are these ISIS or the Syrian rebels? They're nothing compared to the might of the Russian army and the air force. And again, we go to but if we look at a particular conflict that the Russians were um, badly beaten, okay, in the first round, was actually the invasion of Chechnya in the 1990s, okay, and the first Chechen War and the second Chechen War that happened after. It was a very tough war, and the Russians then were not even up against a first-rate power. This was practically another isolated country, but the thing is that it had limited foreign support, and the Chechen fighters were fighting for their country. Okay, um, so the Russians had experienced something had experienced tough fighting there. So we now have the Ukraine, which is much more powerful, has a credible air force, has credible missile capabilities, has when I say surface-to-air missiles, it has a credible army, and then it's being backed up by the Western powers in terms of supplies. So that is something that the Russians have to take into consideration: is that can they can they secure a quick victory? Because if this thing drags on, they're going to suffer. Because we have to remember that the Russians do not have a strong economy. Their economy is actually weaker than the Germans. Okay, and the entire EU is going to be ranged against Russia in support of Ukraine. Although there may not be there might not be foreign troops present in Ukraine, but as advisors there could be, because weapons would start pouring in to the Ukrainians, and the Russians can't do anything about that, not unless they want to try interdicting Ukrainian external supply lines and the risk of larger wars. So would Putin want a larger war? Well, it remains to be seen. Okay, but but the thing is that it's difficult, to make a definite answer to that. But if you look at what Russia is facing, um, one could see that if a larger conflict breaks out, Russia is going to be on a losing end of that. So it will not be conducive to them. So they might opt for a more symbolic uh, operation instead, something that will satisfy national honor, something to that effect.
All right, Professor, one last question. We already have 6 Filipinos who've returned from Ukraine amid the crisis. Would you advise the government to already impose a mandatory repatriation?
Well, the government would like to try, but the thing is that, Filipinos, if they're faced with kapit sa putalim circumstances, no matter how much you try to say mandatory repatriation, if they don't want to go, they won't go. I mean, like, for example, in areas of conflict, of actual conflict, there have been Filipinos who've suddenly been popping up there. Like Iraq during the previous decade, there were Filipinos popping up there because why? Work. So they may try, yeah. Let's see what happens. Because remember, there are only 6 Filipinos who came back. If you look, what's what you mentioned, but there are several hundred still there. So they're not going out. So that's something. How do you convince them? And come back here to what? I mean, to safety, yeah. And then what after that? Would they be able to? Would they be able to find jobs and so on and so forth? That's something very difficult for the Philippine government to. But at least they can mention that, so at least people will see that the government is really trying to exert, or the Department of Foreign Affairs is doing its best to try to convince Filipinos to come back here.
Professor, we'd like to thank you for sharing with us your time and insights. That's Security and Defense Analyst Professor Jose Custodio.
Just call me Jose.
In other news, the Health Department says COVID-19 alert level 1 is possible by March, but that would depend on a number of factors. To tell us more about this, we have Faith Del Mundo this time. She's reporting to us live from Quezon City. Faith, good afternoon. Can you tell us the latest?
Yes, Riza, the DOH says shifting to new normal or alert level 1 is possible, as only 7 areas are now under strict monitoring. But the agency notes that it would depend on the mobility and compliance to health protocols of individuals. In today's Laging Handa briefing, Undersecretary Maria Rosario Berheria said cases by March 15 could drop as low as 83 average cases. She warned, however, that it can also increase by up to 7,700 if there is a reduction of compliance in the protocols, increased mobility, and complacency. With this, the DOH continues to ramp up COVID-19 vaccinations in the country. In fact, there were a total of 3.5 million Filipinos who were inoculated in the third national vaccination drive. Excuse me. As for the pediatric vaccination of 5 to 11 each group, a total of 395,000 have already received an initial dose. For 12 to 17 years old, meanwhile, 9.4 million were already jobbed. Overall, a total of 62.3 million Filipinos are already fully vaccinated against the virus, which is almost 70% of the target population. Only 12.7 million people remain unvaccinated. Excuse me. We said the government is also planning to roll out a national recovery action plan for the economy, and this will also include safeguards to control the spread of COVID-19 in the country. Riza?
Well, thank you, Faith. That was Faith Del Mundo reporting live from Quezon City. Now, for more updates, visit News 5, The Philippine Star, and Business World Online. Visit our website, onenews.ph, for more in-depth analysis. You can also catch One News on Signal Play app. Register for free account now, www.signalplay.com, and stream One News live anytime, anywhere. I'm Riza Diaz. Mask on, wash hands, and stay safe, Philippines. We are One News.